It was a cold evening, the kind where the sky turns gray before the sun even disappears. I was locking up the small diner I had been running for nearly 10 years. Business had been slow, and some days I wondered if keeping the doors open was even worth it anymore. Just as I was pulling the last shutter down, I saw her. A thin girl with tired eyes stood a few feet away, clutching a small bag that looked almost empty. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, hesitant, as if the simple act of asking for food was heavier than her body could bear. Finally, she whispered, "Do you have anything left over?" That question hit me harder than I expected. Instead of handing her scraps, I invited her inside. The diner smelled of faint grease and coffee, the usual blend of long shifts and forgotten corners. I heated up some stew I had made earlier that day, placed it in front of her, and watched as she ate slowly, carefully, almost reverently. It was clear this wasn't the first time she had gone hungry. But what struck me wasn't her hunger. It was the way she paused after every bite, as if she wasn't just filling her stomach, but also trying to hold on to the feeling of being seen, of being cared for. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes carried both gratitude and a sadness I couldn't name. Over the next hour, she told me her story. Her name was Emily, and she had been living in a shelter after losing her job and her apartment. Life had stripped her down piece by piece, until all she had left was her will to survive. She hadn't come to the diner expecting kindness. She had come expecting rejection, or maybe a crust of bread at best. But as she spoke, I realized something important. This wasn't just about hunger. It was about dignity. Every system she had turned to made her feel invisible, unworthy. All she had wanted was food, but beneath that, she needed something more, proof that she still mattered. The next evening, she came again, not to ask for food, but to help me clean. She said, "I don't want to just take, I want to give back." At first, I resisted, insisting she didn't owe me anything. But she insisted harder, and so we scrubbed counters, washed dishes, and swept the floor together. That night, the diner didn't feel so empty. For the first time in months, laughter bounced off the walls. The food she had eaten yesterday filled her body, but what she gave me that night filled my soul. A reminder that even broken people can heal others by simply showing up with honesty and gratitude. Days turned into weeks, and Emily became a part of the diner. She wasn't an employee, at least not officially, but she was family. She started welcoming customers, bringing them water, sharing her smile like it was the most valuable thing in the world. And people noticed. Slowly, the diner that had once been half empty started filling again. Not because my menu had changed, but because the atmosphere had. People came for food but stayed because the place radiated something rare: warmth. Emily's presence reminded them, and me, that food wasn't just about calories. It was about connection, about restoring something that hardship often steals from us. One evening, as I was closing up again, Emily sat across from me and said, "You saved me." But I shook my head. "No, Emily, you saved me." Because the truth was, before she walked into my diner, I was on the edge of giving up, on the business, on people, maybe even on myself. I thought I had nothing left to give, but her courage to ask for help reminded me that small acts can carry enormous weight. She had come for food, but in return, she gave back something I didn't even know I had lost: hope. Years later, people still talk about that diner, not because of the food, but because of the story that started there. Emily went on to rebuild her life. She found steady work, her own apartment, and even came back one day to buy a meal for someone else who looked just as lost as she had once been. That's when I understood something permanent. Healing isn't one-sided. It happens in circles. She came for food, but left behind a legacy of love. And what began as one meal on a cold night became a story of two broken souls who helped piece each other back together. One act of kindness, one shared moment, one human connection at a time. Word about Emily's return and her small act of buying a meal for someone else began to spread faster than I could have imagined. The diner became known as more than just a place to eat. It became a refuge. People who had been too proud to ask for help, or too broken to believe in kindness, started walking through those doors. Some came hungry, others came lonely, and a few just came because they wanted to feel what Emily had felt on that first night. The comfort of being seen. Every time someone left with more than a full stomach, with dignity, with hope, it reminded me how one act of compassion can ripple outward in ways we may never fully see. The diner wasn't just surviving anymore. It was thriving because it had become something bigger than food. It had become a movement of hearts healing each other, one plate at a time. Emily didn't disappear from the diner's story. She returned often, not because she needed help anymore, but because she wanted to be that same quiet strength for others. I watched her sit with strangers, listening to their struggles the way I had once listened to hers. She never judged, never rushed their words. She simply gave them space to breathe, to believe again. She told me once, "When you fed me that night, it wasn't just food. It was a reminder that I wasn't finished yet." That sentence burned into my heart. She had once been the one on the receiving end of kindness, but now she had become the giver. And seeing her do for others what I had done for her proved that healing, when shared, multiplies. Years passed, and the diner evolved into something I never could have planned. Volunteers from the community began showing up to cook meals for the homeless on weekends. People donated coats, blankets, and sometimes just their time to sit with someone who needed a listening ear. It was no longer just my diner. It belonged to everyone who had walked through its doors and left a little lighter, a little stronger. When Emily eventually moved to another city to start her own nonprofit for struggling families, I felt an ache at her absence. But I also felt proud. Proud that a single meal on a cold night had planted a seed that grew into something far greater than I ever imagined. One winter evening, years after Emily had moved away, another young woman came to the diner, shivering and hesitant, much like Emily once had. Her clothes were worn, her eyes filled with the same uncertainty. Without a second thought, I sat her down, warmed a bowl of stew, and placed it in front of her. For a moment, time folded in on itself. It was as if I were back on that first night with Emily. Only this time, I understood the full weight of what I was offering. Not just food, but a spark of hope that might carry her into a better tomorrow. As she took her first bite and her shoulders softened, I realized the circle of healing wasn't just continuing, it was unbreakable. Looking back now, I see the diner not as a place where I served meals, but as a living testament to what love can build out of brokenness. Emily's story became my story, and together we built something far greater than either of us ever dreamed. What began as a desperate plea for leftovers turned into a chain reaction of kindness that spread far beyond our small town. And if there's one truth I carry from it all, it's this. Sometimes people come into our lives looking for something small: food, shelter, a bit of warmth, but they leave us with something immeasurable. They remind us that healing isn't found in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments where one soul reaches for another and simply says, "I see you." As the years rolled on, I began to realize that the diner had become something larger than me, larger even than Emily's story. It had turned into a sanctuary where the broken could find healing and the weary could find strength. Strangers became family, and meals became conversations that stitched people back together. I started training young people from the community, kids who thought they had no future, to cook, to serve, to lead. And in their eyes, I saw the same hunger I had once seen in Emily, not just hunger for food, but hunger for purpose. Slowly, I stepped back, letting them take the reins, because I knew the torch wasn't meant to stay in my hands forever. Kindness doesn't end with one person. It only grows when it's passed on. One day, Emily returned, not as the lost, fragile soul I had once welcomed, but as a woman whose strength radiated in every step she took. She brought with her stories of families she had helped, shelters she had built, and lives she had lifted out of despair. Yet, when she sat down in the booth where she once ate her first meal, she looked around the diner with tears in her eyes and whispered, "This is where it all began." In that moment, I understood something profound. We don't always see the full harvest of the seeds we plant. Sometimes, it takes years, sometimes decades, but eventually, those seeds grow into forests we never imagined. Emily wasn't just my story anymore. She had become the story of countless others who had found hope because she chose to carry the flame forward. Now, whenever I stand at the diner's window and watch people come and go, I don't see transactions or customers. I see a circle, a living, breathing circle of kindness that started with one desperate question. Do you have anything left over? That circle has no end, because every time someone walks out of the diner with a lighter heart, they carry that light into the world. And out there, somewhere beyond my sight, they pass it on in ways I may never know. It might be a meal, a smile, or simply the courage to sit with someone in their pain. But whatever form it takes, it all traces back to one night, one meal, one act of love that reminded two broken souls that healing is never wasted. It multiplies. I often wonder what would have happened if I had closed the diner early that night, if I had turned her away, or if she had been too afraid to ask. The thought chills me because it reminds me how fragile and precious these turning points are. Life doesn't always give us second chances to be kind. Sometimes it hands us a moment, a fleeting chance to give or to walk away, and what we do in that moment can echo for years. Emily came for food, but she gave me back a reason to believe, and through her, the world has been fed with more than meals. It has been fed with hope. And as I sit here now, with the hum of voices filling the diner and the smell of fresh bread in the air, I know one thing for certain. Love may start small, but when nurtured, it becomes eternal. Time has a way of humbling even the strongest walls. The diner's old bricks began to show their age, the counters lost some of their shine, and the seats bore the marks of countless stories written into them. I thought about closing it once more, not because it was failing, but because I wondered if I had given all I could. Yet every time I considered it, someone would walk through those doors with a story that reminded me why the diner existed in the first place. A single mother struggling to feed her kids, a veteran fighting loneliness, a teenager running from a home that didn't feel safe. All of them found a seat here, and all of them reminded me that this place was more than four walls. It was a living heartbeat, and as long as there were people who needed to be seen, the diner still had work to do. One crisp autumn evening, Emily walked back into the diner, older now, her face carrying the strength of someone who had battled storms and learned to dance in the rain. She wasn't just visiting this time, she had come with a vision. Sitting across from me, she laid out her idea, to expand what we had built into something lasting, something that could outlive both of us. She spoke of a foundation that would connect diners, shelters, and kitchens across cities, making sure no one ever felt invisible the way she once had. Her eyes burned with conviction, and for the first time, I saw her not as the girl who had once asked me for food, but as a leader ready to carry a torch into the future. My heart swelled with pride and a touch of sadness, knowing she was ready to take the dream farther than I ever could. The day I handed her the keys to the diner was one of the hardest and proudest moments of my life. The keys were more than metal. They carried years of laughter, tears, lessons, and miracles. My hands trembled as I passed them to her, but Emily's grip was steady, filled with the kind of strength that only comes from walking through fire and choosing compassion anyway. As I stepped outside, watching her flip the sign to open, for the first time as the new keeper of our story, I felt a peace settle over me. The diner was no longer mine. It never really had been. It belonged to every person who had walked through those doors, searching for something small and leaving with something immeasurable. Now, as I sit on my porch in the quiet evenings of retirement, I sometimes hear echoes of the diner, the clinking of dishes, the laughter of strangers turned friends, the soft murmur of lives being mended over simple meals. I know the world is still hungry, not just for bread, but for love, for dignity, for hope. And I know that somewhere, in the glow of that old neon sign, Emily and her team are serving not just food, but the very thing that saved us both years ago. Love passed forward, multiplied, eternal. When I close my eyes, I see that night again. The cold air, the trembling voice asking for leftovers, and I smile. Because what began as a desperate question became an answer for generations. A story of love, of healing, and of hope that refuses to end. Even in retirement, I couldn't walk through town without someone stopping me to share their connection to the diner. A young man once approached me at the market, holding his child's hand. He told me he used to sneak into the diner as a teenager when he had nowhere else to go, and it was Emily who gave him his first real job. "You gave me a chance when I didn't deserve one," he said, his voice cracking. "Now I'm raising my son to believe kindness is the strongest legacy a person can leave." I stood there, speechless, realizing that the diner had grown far beyond meals and walls. It had become woven into the fabric of people's lives, a thread of compassion that stretched into families, futures, and generations I would never meet. Not long after, Emily invited me to a gathering at the diner, though by now it had expanded into something closer to a community center. The neon sign still glowed above the entrance, but inside, I found rows of tables filled with families, volunteers, and children. Emily stood at the front, speaking to the crowd. She told them the story of the first night she walked in, hungry and ashamed, and how a simple act of kindness had saved her life. I listened as she said, "This place doesn't exist because of food. It exists because love dared to show up when everything else failed." Her voice carried a strength I had never heard before, and as the crowd applauded, I realized she had become the storyteller now, carrying the torch of our shared history to people who needed to believe that hope could still exist in a broken world. As the evening ended, a young girl lingered by the door, her hands shoved deep into her pockets, her eyes downcast in the way I had once seen in Emily. Emily noticed her immediately, knelt down, and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Without hesitation, she invited the girl inside, guiding her to a seat as volunteers placed a plate of food in front of her. Watching from the back of the room, my eyes filled with tears. It was happening again, just as it always had, just as it always would. The circle was unbroken. One act of kindness had become a rhythm, a heartbeat that refused to die, passing from hand to hand, soul to soul. That night, walking home under the quiet stars, I felt the weight of my years, but also the lightness of knowing I had lived for something that would outlast me. The diner had begun as a small dream, nearly extinguished by doubt and struggle. Yet, because of one trembling question, "Do you have anything left over?" it had grown into a beacon. And as I lay down to rest, I realized that love never truly belongs to us alone. We borrow it, we share it, and when we pass it forward, it becomes eternal. Emily once came to me for food. She left me with hope. And now, through her and through all those who continue the work, that hope belongs to the world. In the days that followed, I found myself writing more than speaking, scribbling words into a worn leather journal I had kept for years but rarely opened. Page after page, I poured out the memories of the diner, the faces I had met, the laughter that once filled the booths, the tears shed over coffee cups, the hope that had been reborn in so many hearts. I wrote not for myself, but for Emily and for those who would come after her. It wasn't a manual or a history, it was a reminder that sometimes the greatest revolutions begin not with speeches or battles, but with a bowl of stew placed in front of a trembling hand. One evening, I handed the journal to Emily. She opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the words I had written, and I saw the tears she tried to hold back. "These are not just my memories," I told her. "They are yours now. They belong to the future." She hugged me then, tighter than she ever had before, and in that embrace I felt the full circle close, not as an ending, but as a continuation. She didn't need my guidance anymore. She was the guide now, carrying not just the story of her own survival, but the legacy of countless souls whose lives had been touched by the diner. Now, as I sit beneath the same stars that once guided me home, I know my chapter is closing, but I also know the story is far from finished. Somewhere tonight, someone will walk into that diner, or one just like it, hungry, tired, invisible. And somewhere, another hand will reach across a table, offering not just food, but a lifeline. That is the true ending, and the true beginning. A chain of kindness without end. Emily once came for food, but she gave back hope. And in that exchange, we discovered a truth that will outlive us both. That love, once given, never dies. It simply finds new hands, new hearts, new stories to carry it forward. This brings the script to a powerful close, ending the narrator's journey, but showing that the legacy of love continues endlessly.